Welcome back to Shadowed Pages, my dear friends. I'm Edward, and I'm truly delighted to have you join me once again this evening. Where are you tuning in from today, and how has your day been? I always enjoy hearing from you. Leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now, let's begin. The narrow path of Lavender Lane was eerily quiet as Miss Marple walked along, her keen eyes scanning the picturesque cottages that lined the street. Each house, with its ivy-clad walls and neatly trimmed gardens, seemed to hold secrets beneath their peaceful facades. The early morning fog hung low, shrouding the lane in a veil of mystery. It was a quiet place, yet the silence felt heavy, as if the weight of something dark lingered in the air. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back to the previous night, when the bloodstain had been discovered. It was impossible to miss the stark contrast of crimson against the cobblestones in front of one of the cottages. She had arrived just as the local constable, Sergeant Bailey, had begun his investigation, though it was clear that the event had shaken him. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he inspected the scene. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Sergeant Bailey had greeted her the previous night, his voice strained. I don't know what to make of this. There's no sign of a struggle inside, but the blood's unmistakable. It's fresh." Miss Marple had nodded, her mind already piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. It was odd, the way the blood had appeared, as though it had been placed deliberately. But who would do such a thing, and why? Now, as she passed the cottages, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. Her eyes flicked to the window of the cottage where the blood had been found, the curtains drawn tight. The home belonged to a reclusive elderly woman, Mrs. Lambert, known for her eccentric behavior and mysterious past. There had been rumors about her, whispers of strange happenings in her home. Whispers that now seemed to gain a more sinister tone. Miss Marple slowed her pace, her mind working as she mentally retraced the steps of the investigation. The bloodstain had been discovered near the doorstep, but there was no indication that anyone had been harmed inside. No body, no sign of a struggle. Yet the blood was there, a vivid red stain on the otherwise pristine cobblestone. When she had spoken to Mrs. Lambert the previous evening, the old woman had been almost too composed, her eyes too calm. "I don't know what you're talking about," she had said, her voice wavering only slightly. "No one's been hurt here. No one has been inside for days. I don't go out much, you know." Her behavior hadn't been entirely convincing. Miss Marple had sensed a crack in Mrs. Lambert's facade, a subtle shift in her expression that hinted at something more. But Mrs. Lambert had refused to speak further on the matter, retreating behind her closed door. Miss Marple's attention shifted as she spotted a familiar figure in the distance. It was Detective Inspector Gorman, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a sharp, calculating gaze. He was standing outside the bakery, speaking with a local woman who seemed agitated. Miss Marple observed them for a moment, her interest piqued. Gorman caught her eye and gave her a curt nod before excusing himself from the woman. As he approached, Miss Marple could see the tension in his movements, the slight clenching of his jaw. He was a man used to solving problems, but the mystery of Lavender Lane had him stumped. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, his tone professional but tinged with frustration. "I was hoping I'd find you here. We're no closer to finding out who left the bloodstain. There's no sign of anyone entering or leaving the house, and Mrs. Lambert hasn't been seen for hours." Miss Marple gave him a thoughtful look, her gaze drifting toward the bakery where the local woman had been standing. "And what did the woman say?" "Nothing of importance," Gorman replied. "Just the usual gossip. She claims she saw Mrs. Lambert talking to someone last night, but no one knows who. There are no witnesses, no alibis. It's as though the whole village is closing its eyes to what's happening right under their noses." Miss Marple hummed thoughtfully, her eyes narrowing. She had seen that same woman before, though she couldn't place where. Her mind flicked back to a conversation she had overheard at the market a few days prior. The woman had been discussing her daughter's engagement, a topic that seemed innocent enough. But now, with the bloodstain and the disappearance of Mrs. Lambert, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "I think I may have an idea," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but determined. "But we need to gather more information. Let's pay a visit to Mrs. Lambert's neighbor, Mr. Collins. He may have seen something important." Gorman raised an eyebrow but nodded in agreement. "Lead the way." The two walked down the lane, their footsteps muffled by the soft carpet of fallen leaves. Mr. Collins' cottage was only a short distance away, a charming little home with a garden full of rose bushes. He was known for his impeccable lawn and for his occasional grumbling about the local gossip. As Miss Marple knocked on his door, she could sense Gorman's unease. It was a feeling she often experienced herself, a sense that something was waiting to be uncovered, just beyond the surface. Mr. Collins answered the door, his face twisting into a smile as he recognized Miss Marple. "Ah, Miss Marple, what brings you here today?" "We're investigating a matter of some concern," Miss Marple explained, her voice warm but firm. "We believe something unusual may have happened last night near Mrs. Lambert's home. Do you know if she had any visitors?" Mr. Collins frowned, his brow furrowing in thought. "Visitors? No, not that I know of. I mean, she's always been a bit of a recluse, hasn't she? But now that you mention it, I did hear some strange noises last night. Footsteps outside, maybe. Couldn't tell for sure, though. It was all so quiet, like the air was holding its breath." Miss Marple's eyes glinted as she processed the information. "And did you see anyone leaving the house? Anyone unusual?" He shook his head, his expression troubled. "No, nothing like that. But I did see Mrs. Lambert in the window earlier today. She looked different, almost as if she was expecting someone." Gorman exchanged a glance with Miss Marple, his frown deepening. "It seems like there's something more going on here," he said. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind piecing together the fragments of information. "Indeed, we must visit Mrs. Lambert once again. I believe the answer lies within her home." As the three of them made their way back to Mrs. Lambert's cottage, the air seemed to thicken with anticipation. The puzzle was nearly solved. Only one piece remained, and Miss Marple was determined to find it before the day was through. The morning fog had yet to lift, settling in thick coils around the narrow streets of Lavender Lane. Miss Marple adjusted her glasses, squinting as she made her way toward the row of quaint cottages that lined the cobbled street. It was early, and the village was still wrapped in the quiet of dawn, save for the distant chirping of birds and the soft rustle of leaves in the trees. Lavender Lane, despite its tranquil charm, had always carried an undercurrent of mystery, an undercurrent that Miss Marple had often sensed but had rarely seen fully exposed. Today, however, the air felt different, charged with an unease she couldn't shake. As she walked, her thoughts turned back to the previous evening's discovery. The bloodstain had been found just outside Mrs. Lambert's cottage, dark and unmistakable against the pale stone of the cobbled lane. There had been no body, no sign of a struggle, but the blood was there, fresh and stark. Sergeant Bailey, who had been the first to arrive on the scene, had looked more disoriented than usual. His face had been pale, his hands trembling as he bent over the stain, trying to make sense of it. There was no explanation, no trace of a struggle, and yet the blood remained, chilling in its presence. Miss Marple had been silent as she surveyed the scene, letting her mind work in the way it always did, quietly, methodically, observing the smallest details that others might overlook. Mrs. Lambert, the elderly woman who lived in the cottage, had been as calm as ever when Miss Marple had arrived, almost too calm. She had denied knowing anything about the blood, claimed that no one had entered her home for days, that everything was perfectly fine. But Miss Marple had seen the slight crack in her demeanor, the flicker of something in her eyes that suggested she was hiding something. That was the problem with Lavender Lane, Miss Marple thought as she continued walking. It was a place where nothing much happened, at least nothing that anyone was willing to talk about. And yet there was always something lurking just beneath the surface, the kind of thing that only someone like her could see. When Miss Marple had questioned Mrs. Lambert the night before, the old woman had seemed almost rehearsed, her answers too practiced. She had been in her garden earlier that day, tending to her roses as usual, though it was clear from her demeanor that something had been amiss. She had refused to speak more on the matter, quickly retreating into her home, leaving the conversation hanging in the air like a heavy fog. But Miss Marple had learned to trust her instincts. Something was not right. The blood had been placed too deliberately, and Mrs. Lambert's calmness was far too contrived. There was a story there, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to find Detective Inspector Gorman walking briskly toward her, his broad shoulders hunched against the chill. He had a look of frustration etched across his face, his usually calm demeanor now tinged with impatience. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, his voice clipped. "I was hoping to find you here. We're no closer to finding anything out. Mrs. Lambert's story doesn't add up. There's no sign of anyone entering or leaving her house, and yet the blood is still there." Miss Marple gave him a thoughtful look, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. Gorman was a competent detective, no doubt, but he often relied on the obvious facts. Miss Marple, on the other hand, knew that the truth rarely rested on the surface. There was always something more, something hidden just beyond reach. "I'm afraid you're right," she said quietly. "But there is something we're missing. Mrs. Lambert's behavior doesn't match the situation. It's as if she's trying to cover something up, but what?" Gorman frowned. "I spoke to her earlier. She insists that nothing unusual happened, but I can't shake the feeling that there's more going on here than she's letting on." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze turning once again to the small cottage ahead. "Perhaps we should take a closer look at her neighbors. Mr. Collins, for instance. He might have seen something." They approached Mr. Collins' cottage, which sat just a few houses down. The small home was neat, with a garden bursting with flowers, its windows framed by rose vines that seemed to grow more out of habit than any particular care. Miss Marple had always found Mr. Collins to be a somewhat distant man, a solitary figure who rarely engaged with the other villagers, preferring the quiet of his garden to the bustle of town life. Miss Marple knocked gently on his door, and after a moment, it creaked open. Mr. Collins appeared, his weathered face showing a flicker of recognition when he saw Miss Marple. His gaze then shifted to Gorman, and a brief shadow passed over his face. He didn't like the police. That much was clear. "Good morning, Mr. Collins," Miss Marple said kindly. "I hope we're not disturbing you, but we're trying to gather some information about the events last night. Did you happen to see anything unusual?" Mr. Collins paused before answering, his lips thinning into a line. "Unusual? Well, I did hear some strange noises last night. Footsteps, maybe. Hard to say for sure. The wind was strong, and the house creaked a bit. But nothing else, really." Miss Marple studied him closely, noting the faint tension in his shoulders. He was hiding something, of that she was certain. But what? She could tell that he was not entirely comfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Did you happen to see anyone near Mrs. Lambert's house?" she pressed gently. He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, nothing. But Miss Marple, there's always something off about that place. Always has been. You wouldn't know it unless you've lived here for a while, but there's a kind of feeling when you walk past it." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already working through the implications of his words. There was something about Mrs. Lambert's house, something about Lavender Lane, that none of the villagers were willing to speak of openly. The blood was only the latest piece of a puzzle that had been building for years, and Miss Marple was getting closer to finding the missing piece. "Thank you, Mr. Collins," Miss Marple said, turning to leave. "You've been most helpful." As she and Gorman walked back toward the center of the village, the fog seemed to lift slightly, though the mystery remained as thick as ever. The bloodstain had been placed carefully, deliberately, and Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that Mrs. Lambert was not the only one who had something to hide. The truth was out there, just waiting to be uncovered, and Miss Marple was determined to find it. The village seemed to exhale, the air growing still as the morning fog finally began to dissipate, leaving behind a crisp, clear sky. Miss Marple's footsteps were light on the cobblestones as she walked toward the heart of Lavender Lane, her mind churning with the details of the investigation. The more she pieced together, the more she realized that the answer to the bloodstain was not just hidden in the actions of Mrs. Lambert or her neighbors, but in the very fabric of the village itself. Something had shifted in the atmosphere, a subtle change that suggested an unsettling calmness, as though the people of Lavender Lane had long been stewing in their secrets. Gorman had left her earlier, heading toward the village hall to speak with the local constable about the bloodstain. Miss Marple preferred to work alone, to listen to the whispers of the wind, the murmur of distant conversations, and the subtle shifts in body language that others overlooked. She wasn't in a hurry. She knew that the truth, when it arrived, would do so slowly, like a train rumbling in the distance before it came into focus. As she passed by the row of cottages, she stopped at the gate of Mrs. Lambert's house, her eyes narrowing as she took in the modest home. It looked harmless enough, nestled behind a tidy garden, but the unease she felt when she stood near it made her pulse quicken. Mrs. Lambert had always been a reclusive woman, keeping to herself for the most part. The village knew her as someone who preferred her own company to that of others, but she had never been overtly hostile. She simply avoided interaction, keeping her curtains drawn, her doors locked, and her life to herself. But there had always been something in her eyes, a flicker of something that hinted at a past she wasn't willing to share. Miss Marple stood for a moment, staring at the front door, her thoughts turning over what she had learned so far. The blood had been discovered outside, but there was no sign of an intruder. No broken windows, no evidence of forced entry. It was as though whoever had left the blood had done so with deliberate intent. She knew it was important to think about what had been left behind, not just what had been taken. Someone wanted to send a message, and that message had not been meant for Mrs. Lambert alone. Her attention shifted to the garden beside the house. A row of neatly trimmed lavender bushes stood in perfect rows, their pale purple flowers swaying gently in the breeze. Lavender had always been a symbol of calm, of peace, yet the sight of the flowers now made her uneasy. There was something about the order of it all, too perfect, too controlled. She glanced over her shoulder to ensure she was alone before stepping closer to the hedge that bordered Mrs. Lambert's property. A faint sound reached her ears, a low rustling that almost blended with the wind. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, but then she heard it again, the sound unmistakable now. Someone was inside, moving about, just beyond the window. Miss Marple's instincts kicked in. She had been right. Mrs. Lambert wasn't as alone as she had claimed. Someone was in that house, someone who had been hiding in plain sight. Quietly, she moved to the side of the cottage, where a small garden gate led into the back. The door was slightly ajar, its wooden frame creaking in the still air. She hesitated for a moment before pushing it open just enough to slip inside. The interior of the house was dim, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the daylight. The smell of dust and lavender filled the air, mingling with a faint, sour scent that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. It was the smell of neglect, of a home long untouched. As she crept further into the room, her eyes adjusted to the darkness. She could make out the shapes of furniture draped in sheets, old portraits hanging crookedly on the walls, and the faint outline of a door leading to the back of the house. Everything was still, frozen in time, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She moved toward the kitchen, where the faint sound of someone shifting came again, followed by the soft thud of a chair scraping against the floor. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her movements were careful, calculated. She knew she needed to be silent, to gather as much information as possible before revealing herself. The kitchen was dim, but the back door was open, and the sounds of the village outside filtered in. The figure in the room was a shadow against the dim light, but as Miss Marple's eyes adjusted, she could make out the unmistakable shape of Mrs. Lambert. The elderly woman was sitting at the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She appeared deep in thought, but there was something unsettling in her stillness. Miss Marple watched her for a moment, studying the subtle movements of her hands, the way she was pressing her fingers together as if trying to keep them steady. Mrs. Lambert's face was pale, almost gaunt, and there was a look of deep concern in her eyes. She was hiding something that went far beyond the bloodstain outside. Miss Marple stepped forward, making her presence known with the soft shuffle of her feet on the old floorboards. Mrs. Lambert looked up, her expression shifting to one of surprise, then quickly to one of guarded wariness. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight with the effort of maintaining composure. "I didn't expect anyone. What brings you here today?" Miss Marple studied her carefully, noting the tremor in her voice. "I think you already know, Mrs. Lambert," she said quietly. "The blood outside your door, it's not something you can simply ignore." Mrs. Lambert's lips pressed together, her eyes flickering nervously. "I don't know anything about that," she said quickly. "I told you before, I haven't seen anyone. You're mistaken." But Miss Marple wasn't fooled. "I don't believe you," she said gently, "and I think you know exactly who's been here." Mrs. Lambert's gaze faltered for a moment, the briefest flicker of fear crossing her face. Then, with a deep sigh, she leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling in her lap. "I didn't want anyone to know," she whispered, her voice barely above her breath. "But I'm afraid it's too late now." The truth, Miss Marple realized, was beginning to surface. The bloodstain, the secrecy, and the unease in the village had all been leading to this moment. Mrs. Lambert was not the only one hiding something in this quiet village, and soon Miss Marple would uncover the whole story. The air in the cottage grew heavier, charged with the weight of unspoken words. Miss Marple stood in the dimly lit kitchen, watching Mrs. Lambert as she sat motionless at the table, her fingers pressed together in nervous anticipation. The old woman's face had gone pale, her eyes darting to the door, to the corners of the room, as if searching for a way out of the conversation. But there was no escape. Not for her, and certainly not for the truth. Miss Marple had been right to trust her instincts. Mrs. Lambert was hiding something, and it was clear now that the bloodstain outside wasn't the only thing that had been left behind. There were secrets in this house, secrets that had been buried for years, waiting to surface. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence hung thick between them, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards as Miss Marple took a slow step forward. She kept her gaze fixed on Mrs. Lambert, watching her every movement, the subtle twitch of her hands, the way her breath seemed to catch in her throat. At last, Mrs. Lambert exhaled sharply, as though resigning herself to the inevitable. "I didn't want anyone to find out," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought I could keep it hidden, that it would all go away if I just stayed quiet." Miss Marple remained still, her expression calm and patient. She had heard many confessions in her time, each one carrying its own weight, its own story. But there was something different about Mrs. Lambert's words. The old woman wasn't just speaking about the bloodstain or the strange events of the night. She was speaking about something deeper, something far more personal. I never meant for anyone to get hurt, Mrs. Lambert continued, her voice barely above a murmur. But sometimes things happen. People do things they can't take back. Miss Marple's brow furrowed as she processed the woman's words. Who is it, Mrs. Lambert? She asked softly. Who did you try to hide? For a brief moment, Mrs. Lambert's eyes flashed with something, fear, regret, perhaps even shame. But it was gone before Miss Marple could fully make sense of it. The old woman wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes falling to the table as though the weight of the truth was too much for her to bear. It's my son, she said at last, her voice barely a whisper. I've tried to protect him all these years. I thought I could keep the village from knowing what he did, but I can't keep running from it anymore. Miss Marple felt a shift in the air, a subtle change that signaled the beginning of a new chapter in the investigation. Mrs. Lambert's son, so far a figure Miss Marple had not known about, was the key to unraveling the mystery. The bloodstain, the strange behavior, the whispers in the village, they were all pieces of a much larger puzzle, and now at last Miss Marple was holding a piece that would lead her closer to the truth. What happened, Mrs. Lambert? Miss Marple asked gently. What did your son do? For a long moment the old woman said nothing. Her gaze remained fixed on the table, her lips pressed together tightly as though she were weighing the consequences of her words. But then, with a soft sigh, she looked up at Miss Marple, her eyes filled with sorrow. He was involved in something terrible, she said, her voice quivering. Years ago, when he was a young man, he got mixed up with the wrong crowd. They were involved in some illegal activities. I don't know all the details, but I know enough to understand that it was bad. Really bad. People got hurt. Miss Marple's mind raced as she took in the woman's words. Illegal activities. People getting hurt. It was becoming clearer now. The bloodstain wasn't just a symbol of a random crime. It was a reminder of something buried deep within this village's past, something that had festered in the shadows until it could no longer be ignored. And your son, Miss Marple pressed. Where is he now? Mrs. Lambert's hands shook as she clasped them together tightly. He left. He disappeared for a long time. I don't know where he went, but I didn't ask. I thought it would be better that way. I thought if he stayed away, maybe the past could be forgotten. But then, he came back. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. He came back? She echoed, her voice steady but sharp. When? Just a few days ago, Mrs. Lambert said, her voice growing more frantic. He showed up at the door, looking different, haggard, like he hadn't eaten in days. I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe he was back to make amends, to apologize for everything that happened. But when he walked into the house, I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't here to apologize. He was here to finish what he started. Miss Marple stepped closer, her heart racing with the urgency of the woman's words. Finish what he started. What do you mean? Mrs. Lambert's eyes darted toward the window, her expression one of pure fear. I tried to stop him, but it was too late. He said he needed to fix the mistakes he'd made, and the only way to do that was to finish what was left unfinished. He said there was someone who had to pay. The room seemed to grow colder as Miss Marple's mind connected the dots. The blood outside, the secrecy, Mrs. Lambert's son returning to the village, it all pointed in one direction. There was someone who had been wronged, someone who had been hurt in the past, and now the past was coming to collect. I think I know who you're talking about, Miss Marple said softly, her voice laced with understanding. The blood outside, it was meant for someone, wasn't it? Someone who was connected to your son's past. Mrs. Lambert's face twisted in anguish as she nodded. Yes, I didn't want him to do it. I didn't want anyone to get hurt again. But he said he had no choice. And now I fear it's too late. Miss Marple took a deep breath, her mind already working through the possibilities. Mrs. Lambert's son had returned to finish something, to right a wrong. But who had he targeted, and what had he done in the years that had passed since he left? She looked at the old woman, her bare heart heavy with pity. "You need to tell me everything, Mrs. Lambert. I can help, but I need the full story." Mrs. Lambert's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded slowly, as if at last resigned to the truth. The weight of Mrs. Lambert's words hung in the air like a suffocating fog. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, absorbing the depth of the confession, the terror in the old woman's voice. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but there was still much left to uncover. Mrs. Lambert's son, a figure who had remained a shadow in the village, was no longer just a distant memory. He was real, tangible, and his return was far from a simple reunion. It was a reckoning. Miss Marple could see the fear etched into Mrs. Lambert's face. The old woman's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white with strain. She was on the verge of breaking, and Miss Marple knew she needed to guide her through this, to bring her to a place where she could speak the truth without fear. "Tell me everything," Miss Marple said gently, her voice calm but insistent. "I can't help you unless you tell me all of it. The truth, Mrs. Lambert. What happened when your son returned?" Mrs. Lambert's breath hitched, and for a moment it seemed as though she might withdraw again, retreat into the shadows of her own guilt. But then she met Miss Marple's gaze, and something in her shifted. Perhaps the realization that there was no turning back now, no more hiding from the past. "He came to the door as I said," she began, her voice low and steady, but still trembling with the remnants of fear. "At first I didn't recognize him. It had been years, after all. The boy I knew, well, he was nothing like the man who stood before me. His face was gaunt, like he hadn't slept or eaten properly in days. His eyes were hollow, like he had seen too much, been through too much. I didn't know whether to feel relief or terror." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her focus unwavering as she listened, her mind turning over the words, trying to make sense of the pieces Mrs. Lambert was giving her. "And what did he say?" "He didn't say much at first. He just stood there, like he was trying to find the right words. Then he asked if he could come inside, like nothing had ever happened, like he hadn't just disappeared all those years ago. He said he needed to talk. I let him in, against my better judgment, I suppose. I thought, maybe, just maybe, he had come to make amends." The old woman paused, her eyes dropping to the table, as if she couldn't bear to see Miss Marple's gaze. But Miss Marple didn't let her falter. She remained patient, waiting for the rest of the story to unfold. Mrs. Lambert continued, her voice thick with emotion. "He sat down in that very chair over there," she said, gesturing toward the worn wooden seat by the fireplace. "He looked around the room, almost as if he was seeing it for the first time, like he didn't recognize anything anymore. Then he said something that sent a chill down my spine. He said, 'It's time to finish it. Time to make things right.'" Miss Marple's mind whirled at the words. "Finish it." The phrase echoed in her thoughts, its meaning becoming clearer with each passing second. Mrs. Lambert's son hadn't come back to seek forgiveness. He had come to complete something, to finish what had been left undone all those years ago. "Finish what?" Miss Marple asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though the answer were hidden in the air itself, waiting to be revealed. "He didn't explain it clearly," Mrs. Lambert replied, her eyes distant, as if she were reliving the moment. "But I knew. I knew that whatever it was, it had to do with the people he had wronged, the ones who had been hurt because of him. He said it was time for justice, and then he said that someone had to pay." A cold shiver ran down Miss Marple's spine. Someone had to pay. The bloodstain outside Mrs. Lambert's house wasn't just a symbol. It was the first step in something much darker, something tied to the sins of the past. The blood had been a warning, and Mrs. Lambert's son was the one who had delivered it. "Who was it, Mrs. Lambert?" Miss Marple pressed, her voice steady despite the growing realization. "Who did your son want to make pay?" For a long moment, Mrs. Lambert didn't answer. She sat there, her eyes closed, as if she were bracing herself against the truth. "It was George," she said at last, her voice barely audible. "George Holden. He was one of them, one of the men who was involved in the things my son did. But he was worse than the others. He betrayed them. He betrayed my son." Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. George Holden. The name wasn't unfamiliar. He had been a well-known figure in the village years ago, a man who had run a local business before disappearing without a trace. Rumors had swirled around him, rumors of shady deals, of debts unpaid, and of people he had wronged. But nothing had ever been proven, and in time, the whispers had faded into nothing more than gossip. But now, it seemed, those rumors were tied to something far more sinister. George Holden had been involved in something much darker, and Mrs. Lambert's son had returned to seek vengeance for his betrayal. "I never wanted any of this," Mrs. Lambert whispered, tears beginning to well in her eyes. "I thought if I just kept my distance, kept quiet, it would all go away. But now I can't ignore it anymore. I can't pretend like nothing happened." Miss Marple watched her closely, her mind working to fit the pieces together. The blood outside Mrs. Lambert's house wasn't just a warning to George Holden. It was a declaration, a message that the past could not remain buried. Mrs. Lambert's son had returned to exact his revenge, and now Miss Marple understood what had to be done. The clock was ticking and the village was about to be swept into a storm of reckoning. "You need to tell me everything," Miss Marple said, her voice firm but kind. "Where is he now, Mrs. Lambert? Where is your son?" Mrs. Lambert looked up at Miss Marple, her expression haunted. "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. "He left again after he did what he came to do. I didn't want him to go. I begged him to stay, to stop, but he wouldn't listen." Miss Marple's thoughts raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The blood, the vengeance, the return of a long-lost son. It wasn't just a simple crime. It was a reckoning, a final chapter in a dark story that had yet to be fully written. The cottage felt smaller now, the walls closing in with each passing minute. Miss Marple took a step back, her mind racing, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with a slow and deliberate certainty. Mrs. Lambert's confession had given her the final thread she needed to unravel the mystery that had plagued Lavender Lane for so long. The blood outside her house was not a random act of violence. It was a message, a sign that the past had returned to collect what it was owed. "Your son left after that night?" Miss Marple asked, her voice softer now, more composed. She could feel the weight of the old woman's guilt, but she knew that Mrs. Lambert was not the one who needed saving. It was her son and the truth of what had happened years ago that would determine the course of the investigation. "Yes," Mrs. Lambert whispered, her voice trembling once more. "He left, and I thought that was the end of it. But now..." Her words faltered, as though the reality of her son's actions were finally sinking in. She wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron, her face pale and drawn. "Now, I fear he's gone too far, and there's nothing I can do to stop him." Miss Marple stood still for a moment, her thoughts flicking from one idea to another. She had heard the name George Holden before, but it had never been tied to anything more sinister than idle gossip. Now it seemed the rumors were true. George Holden had been involved in something far darker than anyone had known. He had betrayed the group he'd been a part of. Now Mrs. Lambert's son was back to exact the price for that betrayal. "I need to know where he went," Miss Marple said gently, her voice insistent but kind. "You must remember something. Any detail that could lead me to him." Mrs. Lambert's eyes flitted around the room, her mind clearly struggling to find a piece of information that would help. She was clinging to the past, unwilling to let go of the guilt and fear that had kept her silent all these years. But Miss Marple was patient. She could see that Mrs. Lambert wanted to help, wanted to make it right, but she was too afraid of the consequences. It was up to Miss Marple to untangle the mess that had been left in the wake of Mrs. Lambert's silence. "I don't know where he went," Mrs. Lambert said at last, her voice small and defeated. "He didn't tell me. He never does. He just leaves, and I never hear from him again. It's been like that since he was a boy. He disappears and then reappears when he's ready, but always when it's too late to do anything about it." Miss Marple considered this carefully, her brow furrowed. There had to be something, some small clue that would lead her to Mrs. Lambert's son. She knew that people like him didn't vanish completely. They left a trail, even if it was faint. Miss Marple had seen it before, in other investigations where the truth was obscured by fear and silence. There was always something, and in this case, the bloodstain outside Mrs. Lambert's cottage was just the beginning. "There must be someone who knows more," Miss Marple said, more to herself than to Mrs. Lambert. "Someone who saw him, someone who may have spoken with him." Mrs. Lambert shook her head, her eyes still haunted. "He's careful," she said softly. "He doesn't let anyone close. He's always been like that. Ever since that time. After everything happened, he pushed everyone away, even me." Miss Marple took a deep breath, her mind working through the possibilities. There was someone who could know more, someone who might have been involved in whatever secret Mrs. Lambert's son was hiding. She just had to think. There was one person in the village who might have been in contact with George Holden, someone whose name kept drifting to the surface of her thoughts. It was George's business partner, Samuel Jenkins, a man who had been part of the same crowd years ago. He had vanished around the same time that George had, but rumors had always suggested that the two had remained in contact after their disappearance from the village. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. Samuel Jenkins. Of course, if anyone knew where George Holden had gone, it would be him. He had the connections, the knowledge, and the means to disappear just as easily as George had. "I need to speak with Samuel Jenkins," Miss Marple said, her voice now steady and resolute. "He may know where your son went. He's the one who can tell me what happened." Mrs. Lambert looked up at her, her face filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Samuel, you think he'll talk to you after all these years?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "I believe he will. He may not want to, but he will. People like him always leave a trail, and I'm certain that whatever happened between your son and George Holden, Samuel Jenkins is involved." Mrs. Lambert stared at her for a moment as if weighing her words. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I'll take you to him. But please, Miss Marple, be careful. Samuel isn't like the others. He's not someone to be trifled with." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile, though her mind was already turning over the next steps of the investigation. Samuel Jenkins was the key. If he knew where George Holden was, he could provide the final piece of the puzzle. But there was a darkness surrounding the man, and Miss Marple knew that whatever she uncovered, it would be a truth steeped in danger. Together, they left the cottage, stepping out into the bright morning sunlight, but the tension in the air was thick. Mrs. Lambert walked beside Miss Marple, her steps slow and hesitant, as if she too were preparing to confront a past she had long buried. The village, once so quiet and serene, now felt like a place on the edge of a precipice, with Miss Marple at the center of it all, ready to uncover the secrets that had been hidden for far too long. The village had a way of changing as the day wore on. The calm, quiet streets now seemed almost unnaturally still, as if the buildings themselves were waiting, holding their breath. Miss Marple walked alongside Mrs. Lambert, her pace steady but purposeful, though the air around them had thickened with the sense that something was about to break. Mrs. Lambert's nervous glances to either side, her steps slower than they had been when they first left the cottage, did not go unnoticed. Miss Marple felt the weight of her uncertainty, but she also felt the tension in the village itself. It was as if the past, long dormant, was stirring beneath their feet, waking up and reminding them all of its presence. They reached the edge of the village, where the familiar buildings began to thin out and give way to more open spaces. The road grew narrower, and Miss Marple's gaze swept over the quiet fields that stretched into the distance, interrupted only by the occasional tree or stone wall. She had been here many times before, but today, everything felt different. The village, which had once seemed like a quiet haven of secrets well hidden, now felt as though it were on the brink of some inevitable revelation. The house they approached was not like the others in the village. It sat back from the road, surrounded by thick hedges and overgrown trees. The stone walls were dark with age, the windows covered in ivy. It was a house that spoke of time forgotten, of lives lived behind closed doors, and it had always seemed somewhat isolated from the rest of Lavender Lane. This was Samuel Jenkins' home, or what had once been his home. Miss Marple had known about him, of course, even before she had begun to look deeper into the village's past. He had disappeared from the village years ago, leaving behind only vague rumors and half-forgotten stories. A man whose involvement in George Holden's past had never been fully understood, but whose shadow still lingered in the corners of the village. Mrs. Lambert stopped a few paces from the gate, her expression unreadable as she stared at the house. "This is where he lives," she said quietly, almost as if she were speaking to herself rather than to Miss Marple. Or at least, he used to. Miss Marple nodded but didn't speak. The house before them had an air of abandonment, yet there were signs of life. A light in one of the windows, the faintest movement behind the curtains. It was enough to confirm what Miss Marple already knew. Samuel Jenkins was still here, still hiding in plain sight. She stepped toward the gate, the gravel crunching underfoot. Mrs. Lambert hesitated, but after a long pause, she followed. The air seemed to hum as they neared the door, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. Miss Marple had no illusions about what this conversation might bring. Samuel Jenkins was not a man to be easily swayed, and whatever secrets he held, they would not be shared without a fight. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that everyone had a breaking point. It was only a matter of finding it. The door to the house opened slowly, the hinges creaking under the strain. Samuel Jenkins stood in the doorway, his figure tall and imposing, framed by the dim light inside. His face, though weathered with age, still carried the sharpness that had made him a figure of suspicion years ago. His eyes, dark and calculating, locked onto Miss Marple, and for a brief moment, the tension between them was palpable. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and clipped, "what brings you to my doorstep?" "I've come to speak with you, Mr. Jenkins," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm, steady, unwavering. She knew how to handle men like him, men who thought they controlled the conversation, who thought their secrets were theirs alone to keep. "I believe there are things you know, things about George Holden and the events that happened all those years ago." Samuel's eyes flickered, the barest hint of surprise flashing across his face before it was gone, replaced by a cold mask of indifference. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, stepping back slightly, as though he were preparing to close the door. But Miss Marple didn't move, her gaze never leaving his. "I think you do," she said, her voice sharper now. "You and George Holden were involved in something that went wrong. You disappeared, both of you, and now your past has come back to find you. The blood outside Mrs. Lambert's cottage. That's just the beginning. Your past is catching up with you, Mr. Jenkins, and I'm here to help you face it." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, a dare, and for a long moment Samuel said nothing. His gaze flickered to Mrs. Lambert, who had remained silent beside Miss Marple. There was something in the way he looked at her, something almost accusatory, as if she were the reason he had to face this moment. But then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, he stepped back from the door, opening it wider. "You'd better come in," he said, his voice resigned, as if he had known all along this moment was inevitable. Miss Marple entered the house without hesitation, her eyes scanning the interior. The place was dark and musty, with furniture draped in old sheets and a heavy layer of dust covering everything. There was a sense of abandonment here, a feeling of isolation that matched the house's outward appearance. But beneath that, there was something else. Something that Miss Marple had learned to recognize over the years, the faintest trace of guilt of a man who had lived with his actions for far too long. Samuel led them into a small sitting room, the walls lined with bookshelves and the fireplace cold and unused. He gestured toward an old armchair, his movements stiff, as though he were reluctant to have them in his space. Miss Marple took a seat, her gaze still fixed on him, while Mrs. Lambert remained standing by the door, her eyes downcast. For a long moment, Samuel didn't speak. The silence was thick, oppressive, but Miss Marple remained calm, her patience unbroken. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and almost resigned. "You're right," he said. "I know more than I should, but I've spent a lifetime running from it. From him, from what we did." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. "What happened, Mr. Jenkins?" she asked quietly. "What were you and George involved in?" Samuel's eyes darkened, and he let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You wouldn't understand. It's all too late for explanations. All I can tell you is that George Holden wasn't the man you think he was. He was dangerous, always had been. And the things he did, I couldn't stop him. None of us could." Miss Marple waited, her mind processing the fragments of the story as they began to fall into place. Samuel Jenkins had been a part of something far darker than anyone in Lavender Lane had realized. And now the past was coming to collect, its reach far longer than they had ever imagined. The house seemed to close in around them as Samuel Jenkins spoke, the shadows deepening with every word he uttered. Miss Marple sat motionless, her gaze steady, yet her mind was racing. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. It was no longer just a conversation, but a confession, and in that quiet, oppressive space, secrets began to unravel like a thread pulled from the center of a tightly wound knot. Samuel Jenkins seemed to shrink before her eyes, as though the weight of his past had been too much for him to bear alone any longer. His face, once hard and impassive, now looked weary, as though he were finally allowing himself to admit the burden he had carried for years. Mrs. Lambert stood near the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her expression unreadable. "I didn't want it to go this far," Samuel muttered, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "George, he was never like the rest of us. He didn't just do bad things, he enjoyed them. He liked the power, the control. It was never enough for him." He paused, his eyes flickering to Mrs. Lambert. "I should have known then that this day would come, that it would come back to haunt us." Miss Marple didn't interrupt. She simply allowed the silence to stretch, her presence patient, letting him speak when he was ready. The truth was spilling out, and she knew it needed no rush. "The things we did, it was supposed to stay buried," Samuel continued, his voice quieter now, tinged with the bitter taste of regret. "We were involved in some pretty shady business, things that no one in the village ever found out about. We thought we could outrun it, disappear, and never look back. But George, he couldn't let it go. He couldn't let the anger go. He wanted revenge, wanted to punish the ones he thought had betrayed him. And I couldn't stop him." There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something deeper than the guilt. It was fear, fear that had lived with him for far longer than Miss Marple had anticipated. She could see it now in the way his hands trembled slightly, his grip tight on the edge of his chair. He wasn't just a man weighed down by the past. He was a man who knew that past was alive and moving, coming for him. "The blood," Samuel said suddenly, his eyes flashing. It was his way of sending a message. It wasn't just about the betrayal, not just about the people we left behind. It was about him trying to reclaim what he thought was taken from him. Control. Power. And now, He swallowed hard, his voice thick with the realization. Now I'm afraid he's gone too far. He won't stop until it's done, and he's always been one step ahead of us. Miss Marple felt a cold shiver run through her. The bloodstain outside Mrs. Lambert's house had been no ordinary crime, no random act of violence. It had been a calculated move, a harbinger of something much darker to come. This wasn't just about vengeance anymore. It was about someone trying to finish what had been left unfinished for far too long. "Who is he targeting now?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "Who else is in danger, Mr. Jenkins?" Samuel's face contorted with a mixture of fear and self-loathing, as if he were unwilling to admit the consequences of his own involvement. "George. He's after anyone who was part of it. Anyone who played a role in what happened all those years ago. But there's one person who has always been the target, the one who betrayed him the most. His name is Henry Graves." Miss Marple's mind clicked instantly. Henry Graves. The name had come up before, fleetingly, in whispers at the market and in the village square. Graves had been another figure from the past, another ghost haunting the streets of Lavender Lane, though his role in the mystery had always been shrouded in ambiguity. Now the pieces were coming together. George Holden wasn't just hunting down faceless victims from his past. He was hunting someone specific, someone who had played a pivotal role in whatever it was that had gone wrong all those years ago. "Where is he now?" Miss Marple asked, her voice hardening. She knew time was running out. "Henry Graves. Where can we find him?" Samuel looked down at his hands, his face lined with a mixture of regret and fear. He disappeared years ago, after everything fell apart. Last I heard, he moved to London, tried to start fresh. But I don't think George ever forgot about him. He never could. Not after what happened. Miss Marple rose from her seat, her eyes scanning the room as her mind worked swiftly. She was starting to see the full picture now, the way all these people were connected by their choices, their betrayals, their need to escape from something they couldn't outrun. But George Holden wasn't done with any of them. He had come back to finish what he believed had been left unfinished, and Miss Marple knew she had to act quickly. Henry Graves was the key to it all. If George was after him, then he was already a step ahead, and Miss Marple wasn't about to let him claim another victim. "I have to find Henry Graves," she said quietly, her tone resolute. "And I have to find him before George does." Samuel's eyes widened in disbelief. "You don't understand, Miss Marple," he said quickly, his voice growing more frantic. "If George knows you're looking for Henry, he'll come after you too. You're in danger. We're all in danger." Miss Marple paused at the door, her hand on the handle. She had heard his warning, but she wasn't afraid. The danger was already here. The blood had already been spilled, and now it was a matter of stopping it before more was lost. She turned back to face him, her gaze unwavering. "I've been in danger before," she said calmly, "and I've always found a way to stop it." With that, she stepped out of the house, the door closing softly behind her. Mrs. Lambert had remained silent during the conversation, her face pale and filled with concern. Miss Marple gave her a brief look, her expression soft but determined. "We need to find Henry Graves," Miss Marple said, "and we need to find him fast." Together, they walked away from the house, the weight of what they had learned settling in the space between them. The clock was ticking, and the shadows that had once been buried in the past were beginning to stir, moving closer with every passing moment. The village of Lavender Lane felt almost unreal as Miss Marple walked through it, her steps sure but quick. The morning sun had finally pierced the lingering fog, casting long, sharp shadows along the cobblestone streets, yet there was a darkness beneath the light now, something that wasn't there before. The air, once fresh with the scent of lavender and early spring, now seemed thick with anticipation, as though the very earth was holding its breath. Miss Marple felt it too, a low hum of tension that seemed to reverberate through every building, every corner. The past wasn't just a memory anymore. It was here, and it was coming for someone. Henry Graves, she whispered to herself, the name echoing in her mind. She had to find him, had to make sure that he was safe, or at least that George Holden didn't find him first. Samuel Jenkins had been right. The past had its claws in all of them, and George Holden, the man who thought he could control everything, was closing in on the last thread of unfinished business. It had taken a few questions and a bit of digging, but Miss Marple had finally found the lead she needed. Henry Graves wasn't hiding in London as Samuel had suggested. He hadn't gone far at all. The village's shadowy secrets always had a way of creeping back, no matter how well they were buried. Henry Graves had lived in a small cottage just outside Lavender Lane for years, an isolated place on the edge of the village, far enough to keep people from asking too many questions, but close enough for someone to find. The house was tucked between tall, wild hedgerows, nearly swallowed by the overgrowth. A ramshackle garden, overgrown and untended, had spilled onto the narrow path that led up to the door. Miss Marple paused for a moment at the foot of the steps, her eyes scanning the house. There were no signs of life, no movement behind the curtain-drawn windows, but something about the place told her that it had been lived in recently. It wasn't just the faint smell of tobacco in the air or the flicker of shadows within the windows, it was the stillness. The kind of stillness that spoke of a man who had retreated into his own world, trying desperately to leave behind whatever had come before. She knocked firmly on the door, her knuckles rapping against the wood with a measured, deliberate rhythm. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought she might be met with nothing at all. But then, the door creaked open slowly, and a pair of dark eyes met hers. They were tired eyes, worn down by the years, but they held a certain guarded recognition. Henry Graves stood in the doorway, his broad frame silhouetted against the dim light of the cottage interior. His face was older than Miss Marple remembered, but there was no mistaking the man who had once been a figure of power in the village, a man whose name had lingered in whispers and rumors long after he had disappeared from view. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken much in the past few days. He didn't seem surprised to see her, but there was a hesitancy in his movements, a reluctance to welcome her fully into his space. "What brings you here?" "I need to talk to you, Mr. Graves," Miss Marple said, her voice even but firm. "It's about George Holden." The mention of George's name made the tension in Henry's face visible, his eyes darkening. He glanced over his shoulder, as though he were considering whether to close the door and retreat back into the shadows of his own mind. But then, as though the weight of his past were finally too much to bear, he stepped aside and motioned for Miss Marple to enter. The interior of the cottage was dim, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and mildew. Dust motes floated in the light that streamed through a small window, casting long shadows on the walls. It was the kind of place one could easily disappear into, and Miss Marple could sense the years of solitude that had filled it. She stepped into the room, her shoes quiet against the worn wooden floor, and took a seat by the hearth. Henry sank into the chair opposite her, his eyes fixed on the ground. "You've been living here for some time, I see," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "I suppose it's not a coincidence that George Holden is suddenly reappearing in the village, is it?" Henry's lips tightened and he didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, each second drawing them closer to the inevitable confrontation. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and thick with emotion. "I thought I could leave it behind," he muttered. "Thought if I just kept my head down, stayed out of the way, no one would remember the things we did. But George, he never forgets. He never lets go of the things that haunt him, and now I'm not sure what's left, what he's going to do." Miss Marple watched him carefully, noting the rawness in his voice, the way his hands fidgeted with the frayed edge of his shirt. This man was not the one who had once commanded power in the village, not the one who had been part of whatever dark dealings had tied him to George. This man was afraid, a man who had been hunted by his own actions for far too long. And now, it seemed, he was about to face the consequences. You're afraid of him, Miss Marple said quietly, her voice soft but cutting through the tension. But there's more at stake here than just your fear. There's more at stake than you and George. Henry looked up at her, his eyes wide with something like surprise. What do you mean? He asked, the vulnerability in his voice unmistakable. There are others, Miss Marple said. Others who are still in danger. George isn't just after you, Henry. He's after anyone who was involved. Anyone who had a hand in the past. And I believe you're the key to stopping him. Henry's expression faltered, and for the first time he seemed to truly grasp the magnitude of the situation. I don't know how to stop him, he whispered, almost pleading. I've spent years running from him, hiding from what we did, but he's always been one step ahead. I'm not the one who can fix this. I can't fix it. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. Perhaps you can't fix it alone, but you're not alone now. We need to stop George before he does something he'll regret, before someone else gets hurt. The air in the room seemed to grow thicker with the weight of her words, but as Miss Marple watched Henry, she saw a flicker of something, perhaps hope, perhaps just the faintest recognition of responsibility. The past had come for him, but it wasn't too late. It wasn't too late to make things right. Henry Graves finally nodded, his face set with a grim resolve. What do we do now? He asked, his voice stronger than it had been before. We find George Holden, Miss Marple said softly, and we make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else. The fog had settled once again over Lavender Lane, though it felt less oppressive now. The village, once filled with an eerie, quiet tension, now seemed to be holding its breath in anticipation of something final, something that would bring closure. Miss Marple walked with purpose, her every step in tune with the rhythm of the unfolding resolution. Beside her, Henry Graves moved more cautiously, his face lined with the weight of everything that had happened, but his eyes clearer now. Resolute. They had found George Holden. The search had not been easy, but after piecing together the scattered details from the past, Henry had led Miss Marple to the place where George had been hiding, a secluded cabin on the edge of the forest, just beyond the village's borders. It had been carefully hidden, tucked away from view, but not from those who knew where to look. The cabin stood there now, dark and quiet, surrounded by the thick trees that reached like skeletal fingers toward the sky. No light flickered from within, but Miss Marple knew better than to be deceived by appearances. George Holden was in there, and he was ready for the final act of his story. The door creaked open before Miss Marple had a chance to knock. George stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the light behind him. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken with the same hollow intensity that had marked his return to the village. But now, as he looked at Miss Marple, there was something different in his eyes, something not just of madness, but of recognition. Miss Marple, he said, his voice low but steady. I knew you'd come for me. They always do eventually. I didn't come for you, George, Miss Marple replied, her voice calm and steady. I came for the people you're going to hurt if you don't stop. He smirked, the familiar arrogance still there, even in the face of his own downfall. You think I'm the one who's going to hurt someone? You think I'm the monster here? Miss Marple didn't flinch. She had seen this game before. She had seen men like George Holden try to manipulate the narrative, try to make themselves the victim when they were anything but. You've hurt enough people, George. You've used fear and vengeance to control everything, but it's over now. Henry stood behind her, his expression a mixture of fear and resolve. It was clear that he wanted to move forward, to confront the man who had haunted him for years. He stepped forward, his voice shaky but firm. George, it's over. It was never worth it, what we did. All of it. It was wrong. You don't have to keep running. You don't have to do this anymore. George's eyes flickered toward Henry, his expression briefly tightening, a flash of something unreadable passing through them. But then the smirk returned, the familiar mask of control. You're wrong, he sneered. "I've only been following what's rightfully mine. You all abandoned me. I've come to claim what's owed." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "Nothing you've done has been justified, George. The people you've hurt, the damage you've caused, it's too much. You've been chasing ghosts for far too long." George's jaw tightened, but there was a moment of hesitation. Miss Marple could see it now, the cracks in the facade. Beneath the bravado, there was a man who had spent so many years living in his own delusion that he couldn't remember what it was like to just let go, to release the hatred that had driven him. "You can't keep going like this," Miss Marple continued softly. "You don't have to carry the weight of everything anymore." For a moment, George looked as though he might break, as though the mask might slip and the anger, the years of resentment, would dissipate. But then he straightened, his eyes hardening once more. "You think you've won? You think I'll just give up?" Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. "I don't think you've won, George. I know you've already lost." He opened his mouth to speak, to retort, but then he faltered, as if the words caught in his throat. There was something there, something deeper than the anger, something that had been buried for so long. Miss Marple stood tall, her gaze steady. "You don't have to keep fighting. The past doesn't have to own you." It was then that George seemed to deflate, the fight draining from him as if Miss Marple's words had finally pierced the layers of bitterness he had wrapped around himself. He looked at Henry, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something like regret in his eyes. Henry took a cautious step forward, his voice softer now. "It's not too late, George. You can still make it right. There's a way out of this. You don't have to be the man you've been." George seemed to sway, the weight of everything he had done, everything he had lost, catching up with him. The anger was still there, but it was tempered now with something that Miss Marple could only call the beginnings of understanding. "I've done too much," George said, his voice barely a whisper, his head bowed. "I can't undo it." Miss Marple's voice softened. "No one can undo the past. But you can choose what comes next. You can make a different choice. Now." For a long moment, the cabin was silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. Then, George looked up, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's, and for the first time, there was something close to surrender in them. The door stood wide open, and the weight of his years of choices, of anger and fear, seemed to lift, if only for a moment. He stepped back from the doorway, his hand falling to his side. "It's too late for me," he said quietly, his voice ragged. "But you're right. I can't keep doing this." Miss Marple turned to Henry, who stood there, uncertain but watching George closely. He had helped guide the man to this moment, helped him see that there was more than just running, more than just fighting. The road ahead for George Holden was not going to be easy, but at least, for once, it seemed he might choose a path that didn't end in violence. "You don't have to go alone," Miss Marple said to Henry, her voice gentle. "There's still time for both of you." With a long, slow breath, Henry stepped forward, finally closing the distance between them. He reached out a hand toward George, who, for a moment, didn't move. But then, almost imperceptibly, George took it, his grip firm, yet lacking the hostility that had once been so defining. The past had not been erased, but it no longer had the power to control them. The village was still and quiet, the weight of the last days lifting slowly, gently. And in that quiet, Miss Marple allowed herself a brief moment of peace. She had done what needed to be done. And now, for the first time in a long time, Lavender Lane could begin again,